Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Tokyo College webinar. So today, June 5th, is United Nations World Environment Day. And the theme of World Environment Day this year is Solutions to Plastic Pollution. And this comes just a few days after the United Nations Environmental Assembly's International Negotiating Committee on Plastics Pollution concluded their dialogue to attempt to develop binding international agreements on addressing the plastics crisis. Here at Tokyo College, we felt this would be a good opportunity to bring together a diverse panel of experts to discuss the problem of plastics pollution from various disciplinary angles, and also drawing on experiences from different parts of the world. We'll be hearing about the situation regarding plastics pollution in India, Japan, and also in Australia. Our speakers will be covering a range of topics, including the impacts of plastics pollution on human and non-human health, the technical aspects of how plastic waste is collected, disposed of, and recycled, the social lives of waste workers, the importance of policy and good governance, and we'll be looking at some examples of some very innovative projects to manage plastic waste in a socially just and economically viable manner. Joining us here to discuss this are Robin Jeffrey, retired academic but currently affiliated with the National University of Singapore, Aparna AGARWAL, who recently obtained her PhD from the University of Oxford, Assa DORON, Professor of Anthropology at the Australian National University, and Jun NAKATANI, Professor of Engineering at the University of Tokyo. We'll also be screening a video that we've been sent by Anish MALPANI, a social entrepreneur and director of the organization Ashaya. Ashaya are working on innovative approaches to plastics recycling, working directly with waste workers cooperatives and on forms of plastic that are often considered stubbornly difficult to recycle. Unfortunately, Anish cannot join us in person today due to another commitment, but he's pre-recorded his presentation for us today. Okay, so our first speaker is Robin Jeffrey, currently visiting research professor at the National University of Singapore. Robin is a towering figure in the study of South Asia, having written extensively on Indian history, politics, and the impacts of telecommunications technology in on Indian society. He is the co-author, along with Assa DORON, one of our other panelists, of Waste of a Nation, Garbage and Growth in India, which investigates India's waste management challenges. Today, he'll be going into some of the governmental aspects of plastic pollution in India, and I believe also in Australia. So, Robin, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Trent. Thank you for having me. Let me move fairly quickly and say that plastics and governments have something in common. They're both very complicated, and we really can't live without either. Plastics and governments are pretty essential, but we can't live with plastic infinitely. Plastics are made of finite materials, and those materials, petroleum-based, are going to run out one day. And only by using the mechanisms of governments are we going to be able to control them and use them for the best purposes. For the past 50 years, plastic has been cheap and easy, and we see it every day, and we can see from the slide how useful plastic can be. The bottle on the left is the plastic 1 liter bottle, which weighs 20 grams. The bottle on the right is a glass bottle, only 3/4 of a liter, and it weighs 1.5 kilograms. Absolutely essential for so many purposes in our everyday life in our kitchens. But plastic needs to be treated like dynamite or sulfuric acid, something that is indispensable but dangerous, has to be managed. We use more plastic than we need to, and we dispose of plastics in dangerous ways that choke life. And that's where government comes in. Governments have to take the lead in limiting the plastics we use.
Robin,
Yes.
May I just ask, I think you haven't shared your slides.
The slides are not
Okay.
better?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. As I say, the slide that you see in front of you illustrates the utility of plastic in that so much more can be done with it and it can be managed so much easier if from commercial purposes. But of course, it has all sorts of industrial and medical purposes as
Robin?
well. No, thanks, Trent. And I'm sorry for the glitch. The utility of the plastic bottle is just one thing that we see in our kitchens every day. And as I was saying, governments come in because plastic must be managed if we're to use it intelligently in the future, because at the moment it's cluttering up the world. There are lots of different kinds of plastic, as again, we can see from microplastics at one point, the sorts of things that are getting into water supplies and into the human body, tiny plastic particles that we seem to exude into the atmosphere and the environment every day from a multitude of personal care products, soap products, and a great many other ways. And of course, these microplastics get into the bodies of marine life and may come back to poison human beings as well. And then there's the vast uses of plastic for industrial purposes. In this slide, you see a scientific landfill using plastic to cover its materials at night to keep the dust from blowing over the neighborhood and polluting the air, and also to prevent rain from leaching through the waste material. So huge industrial uses of plastic. The different types of plastic, of course, get tangled up. And in order to use them in the most effective way, they need to be separated again. And that's a little bit like the way governments work. There are a great many governments in the world at various levels, and they tend to get tangled up as well. I live in the state of Victoria, which has a population of only about 7 million, just a little bit larger than Singapore, in an area much, much larger than Singapore, as you can see. We have 79 local governments, and each of our local governments has a population of about only 100,000 people. But our local governments are responsible for the collection and disposal of residential and commercial waste, but our state and our national government lay down the rules for dealing with building and construction waste, industrial waste, and medical waste, all of which, of course, are plastic-consuming waste streams. Each of our 79 local governments has developed its own methods for keeping its territory clean and tidy. That means that collecting and disposing of waste is a complicated matter which has to be agreed in some ways amongst these very small units of government. In the city of Yarra, we have 3 bins for putting our household waste, but in some of our neighboring municipalities, there may be only 2 bins, or in one, there are 4 bins. It's complicated. And I'm sure in Japan, there are much more effective ways of dealing with the sorting of waste and much better disciplined ways than we have in Australia. Sometimes too, local governments fight with each other. In one case in India that I know, one local government took another to court because the second one was depositing its waste in the well-managed territory of the first government. We see a little bit of how the old practice of dumping your waste is recognized in India. In the slide you see a poster from the Indian Clean India campaign of 4 or 5 years ago, trying to improve public sanitation in India. The billboard is ridiculing the prosperous householder who is dumping her waste off her balcony into the street with the notion that somebody else will pick it up and do the work. That's the problem with plastics. How do we dispose of them? We can, of course, do as the lady is doing and simply throw them out the window and hope somebody else will deal with them. Or we can dump them in a landfill or throw them into water bodies where they don't decompose. And that was the old way, really, to just throw things out and hope for the best. But of course, we can't do that with plastics. Plastics last almost forever, certainly forever in our human terms. We can burn plastics, of course. The kinds of landfills you see in the slide, this is the great DORON land dump out in downtown, virtually in downtown Bombay in India, one of the great landfills or public dumps of the world. That's where most plastic in Bombay still, I think, ends up. So we can do that. We can dump them in water areas, or we can burn them, which is what's happening on this dump in Tiruvananthapuram in South India. But we can burn, of course, plastics safely, as you have been doing in Japan, and they do in Singapore and in the Nordic countries for many years, in high combustion incinerators. And they minimize the bad air, the toxic air that can come out of burning, and which the man in the slide is experiencing, of course, inhaling all that plastic, poisonous plastic smoke. But high combustion incinerators of the kind used in Japan and Singapore are expensive to build, they're costly to run, they're high maintenance, and they need a steady supply of fuel. The good thing about high combustion incineration is that it seems to be relatively safe. It gets rid of most waste and reduces it to about 1/10 of its volume, but it nevertheless doesn't encourage us to recycle, to minimize or reuse. These big plants, such as this rather unsuccessful one in Delhi, which has not been a great success, unlike the plants in Singapore, and I'm sure the great Mitsubishi plants in Japan, which are highly successful and proven over 20, 30, 40 years. So the high combustion incineration is simply not practical in a great many places. And in Australia, it's very contentious even to talk of introducing it, because environmentalists will say, no, 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 it's a very bad thing to do. It's a bad habit to get into. We can, of course, decompose plastics into their constituent elements through the process called pyrolysis. But of course, pyrolysis heats plastic until it breaks down it heats plastic without oxygen until the material breaks down into its constituent elements. The elements can be isolated and then recomposed to make other products. But the process is expensive. It's still relatively small scale. And again, not practical in most global conditions. The most realistic way of getting rid of plastic in some places in India, these photos are from Calcutta, is to simply chop the plastic bottles and other plastic materials up into pellets, pelletize them, and remake them. In getting a cheap extruder, the photo you see here is taken in a warehouse in a poor part of Calcutta. It's being run semi-legally, probably with electricity borrowed off the grid without paying the tariff. And it's remaking those plastic chips we saw here into plastic materials, which are coming out of the extruding machine. The problem is these can only remake plastics of a fairly low quality, like these window braces and door braces that you see in the slide here. But these can be done as a cottage industry. However, there's a limit to how many door brackets and park benches the world needs. It must be, any kind of recycling of plastic must have a market for the recycled product. These are some of the complications of plastics, and that's why the role of governments in fixing some of these problems is absolutely essential. At the big end of government, governments need to be there for the cases where high combustion incinerators are absolutely necessary in order to ensure the capital investment is put into these incinerators and that they get the steady maintenance and supply that they require. Local governments, on the other hand, need to establish larger units of plastic management to ensure readily intelligible rules for we people who make waste and for the plants that may remake that waste into some other product, who in effect are recycling it or at least disposing of it. Local governments have to make those rules. Higher level of governments need to ban unnecessary plastic, the plastics that go into shopping bags, drinking straws, packaging, and so on. Higher levels of government need to support as well research into small-scale technologies that can make most plastics endlessly reusable so that we don't diminish supplies. And you'll hear a little bit about this from Anish MALPANI in his recorded video later in this afternoon's presentation. Local governments too must find sites where these decentralized technologies can operate. And collectors of plastics, garbage collectors, waste pickers, need to be built into programs that capture plastic waste and put it to use. And I'm sure Aparna will have much more to say about such things. The collectors are crucial because precise sorting, first, capturing of plastics is essential if their ill effects are to be mitigated, but plastic sorting is essential to ensure that plastics of one type are kept together so that they can return in a maximum way in new products later on, if recycling is what we're trying to do. The value of thrown away plastics begins with the collecting and the segregating of it. And you see here women engaged in just that kind of waste management in the Indian city of Pune. Today, we can't live without plastic, but we have to control it. And the heroes of plastic management are the people who start that process, the kinds of people you see in the slide on the screen. So that's my statement about the complications of governments and of plastics. And I look forward to a very interesting discussion to come. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Robin. We might move straight on to our next speaker, which is Aparna AGARWAL. Aparna recently obtained her PhD from the University of Oxford. Her thesis was an in-depth study of the social aspects of a very large, okay, sorry, I'm just, Robin, could you just stop your screen share?
Yes.
Right, so Aparna's PhD thesis was an in-depth study of the social aspects of a very large landfill site on the periphery of Delhi, with special attention to the lives of waste workers. She'll be discussing the social and governance aspects of that site today. So over to you, Aparna.
Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So thank you, Trent. So Professor Jeffrey has given us a broad introduction about how we should understand plastic in today's time, whether it's about its ill effect or whether about the forms of governance around plastics. I am going to focus specifically on Delhi's plastic waste economies, and I'm going to focus broadly on what governance of plastic means and its interaction with the materiality of plastic and the effect it has on the lives of waste workers across waste economies in Delhi. So I'll be focusing on waste pickers, scrap dealers, traders, and recyclers in Delhi. I mean, like if we go back to the first slide, the photograph is of lots of pens collected by a scrap dealer in Delhi. So when I started my conversation with that scrap dealer, that person said that, "Madam, you've come here to talk about plastic. Do you realize that our present day existence is all plastic? The pen that you're using right now is a plastic pen. Your notebook has a very thin layer of single-use plastic, and your mobile cover with which like you're recording me, it has a layer of plastic." So like as you're researching on plastic, you're defined by the presence of plastic around you. So it is in this context, and I'm going to start talking about plastics. And like as Professor Jeffrey told us, like it's increasing. The presence of plastic today is increasing at a very significant level. And so let's see what it means, what its presence means in Delhi. Can we go to the next slide, please? So over a period of time, and I'm going to focus on plastic waste management rules in Delhi, say from 2016 to 2022. So over a period of time, there have been many changes in plastic waste management rules in India. And those waste management rules, they primarily concern single-use plastics. So so I'm going to focus on why there is so much focus on single-use plastics in India and how it affects the lives of waste workers. Before we do that, I'm just going to very briefly talk about division of waste economies in India. So can we move to the next slide, please? So I think this chart is not a very correct description, because informal waste, because they come at the base of the waste economies in India, and most of the waste pickers by default are informal waste pickers, and they're mostly lower caste waste pickers in India. And then we have itinerant buyers and sellers, who also mostly, whom we call kabadi walas in at least in northern part of the country. And they're again mostly they're from scheduled caste and other backward classes in the country, and they again operate within broadly within the informal economy. Then we have scrap dealers and traders who are part of both formal and informal economy. And then finally, because scrap dealers and traders are buying and selling their stash from waste pickers and itinerant buyers and sellers. And then after that, we have recyclers, who are mostly, one, they're from the upper caste communities in the country, and here more specifically in Delhi, and they're mostly located in the industrial areas of the city, which are again on the periphery of the city. So these recyclers, as Professor Jeffrey showed us, like they're mostly buying stash from big scrap dealers and traders, and then they basically grind those trash, and then that material goes into the factories, it's grinded, it's melted, and then it's given a new form. So that's basically how scrap economies operate in India. So having explained this, I'm now going to move towards single-use plastic and plastic waste management rules around them. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next one. And the next one. Sorry, I cannot basically, and the next one. Yeah. So now I'm going to focus on the shifting specification of single-use plastic and the politics of plastic ban around it. So many scholars in India have argued that when we talk about plastic ban in the country, the primary focus has been on single-use plastic, which is also to say that the focus is more on the consumers rather than the producers. So when we talk about single-use plastics in India, we are talking about mostly straws and cutleries, glasses. And when we talk about their ban, either the ban focuses more on the street vendors or the consumers. The focus is not really on the producers. And single-use plastic is seen as a form of litter around the country, and hence the focus on the ban. Whereas there is not much focus on virgin plastic, which is getting produced in excess quantity every day in the country. So now the specifications of SUP and the politics around it that I'm going to talk about is that why there has been so much focus on the single-use plastic in itself and not other forms of plastic, which then again also tells us that we are focusing on the particular aspects of plastic, and hence when we are talking about a very particular form of materiality of plastic. So we are not talking about virgin plastic, but we are only talking about single-use plastic. So now India's first plastic waste management rules, they were introduced in 1999. and it aimed to limit the use of plastic carrier bags under the thickness of 20 microns or less. Similarly, the plastic waste management and handling rules were again notified in 2011 and 16, and they again focused on single-use plastics. So, and also, as I explained, these rules also see that how the microns of these plastics are continuously changing, and these microns explain how single-use, the definition of single-use plastic is continuously changing, and there is no mention of other forms of plastics. So the latter means 2011 and 16 rules, they also proposed advanced phasing out of multi-layered plastic and stipulated that polluters pay and extended producers responsibility. However, even though these rules were still better than what were introduced in 1999, they mostly remained a paper tiger. The recent initiative to ban plastic in India also considerably failed. The 2019 plastic ban suddenly introduced a ban on single-use plastics without clearly defining the term and without even considering the impact it might have on waste pickers, scrap dealers, traders, and recyclers. For many waste pickers, single-use plastic items such as milk pouches, plastic bags used by vegetable vendors, and packaging wrappers form a substantive volume of their daily collection. But with the introduction of the ban, many of them could not sell these materials they had collected over months. So the sudden announcement jolted the entire sector and rendered many of them unemployed. The ban also led to the significant falls in the rate of plastic. Moreover, the ban was followed by the sealing of several plastic recycling units in Delhi. So these recycling units, Narela, Bhavana, they are again on the northwestern periphery of the city. And Mundka is again a very big plastic recycling hub, which is located in the western part of the city. And it's one of the biggest plastic recycling hubs in Asia. So as per one of the Indian newspapers reported, around 109 plastic recycling units were sealed, and they were either sealed because they did not comply with the plastic waste management rules, or because they were recycling single-use plastic purchased from local dealers that contained dirt and had extremely harmful polluting effects. Next slide, please. So the coming together of single-use plastic ban and the sealing of recycling units had a devastating effect on plastic recycling industry. This forced the government to stay the ban and advance a plan to phase out single-use plastic in 2022. However, in the middle of the pandemic, right after the devastating second wave of COVID-19 in India, the government notified the draft plastic waste management amendment rules in 2021. Unlike other rules, the 2021 rules specify SUP products, SUP again, single-use plastic products, and put the onus of plastic waste management on recyclers under a broad umbrella category of plastic waste processors, including recyclers, waste pickers, itinerant buyers, sellers, traders, and industrialists and brand owners. Here, SUP products are broadly defined in terms of plastic flags, candy sticks, ice cream sticks, thermocol for decoration purposes. The draft proposes a ban on the manufacturing as well as recycling of SUP items. In addition, the draft also proposes increasing the thickness of plastic carrier bags from 50 microns to 120 microns. So this draft bill is a move forward in line with the other bills. Next slide, please. So similarly, the latest in the series of amendments in plastic waste management rules is the rules 2022. The rules have specified important definitions such as SUP and end of life disposal. The SUP is defined as a plastic commodity intended to be used once for the same purpose before being disposed of or recycled. This time, the rules have again specified 19 items that count as SUP. As per the rules, the carry bag should be at least 75 microns and above, and hope to extend it to 120 microns after 31st December 2022, which actually did not happen. Although these rules are a step forward in terms of concrete definitions and guidelines, however, if one looks closely at the rule since 2016, it shows the specification of SUP in terms of microns have changed in the last 8 years. More specifically, in the last 4 years, the specification of SUP has changed 3 times. So even though the government is trying to phase out SUP, the shifting specification of SUP puts significant pressure on recyclers as to what kind of plastic to use. According to one of the leading Indian newspapers, that is the Indian Express, according to its reportage, shopkeepers in different parts of the big markets in the country, such as Sadar Bazaar and Jabri Bazaar, two popular wholesale markets in Delhi, complained about the lack of alternative options. Many of them had already bought single-use products to sell their items, but now cannot use them. Not only will it lead to major financial losses, but they might be fined for possessing single-use plastic products. These fears were further exacerbated by the rising prices of alternative options such as paper coverings. Some shopkeepers expressed that they switched to paper bags and covers, but the sudden increase in their prices due to an increase in demand pushed customers away. Next slide, please. So what happens is, by the time recyclers and shopkeepers adjust to a given specifications, new rules are already notified. So the shift in microns and the changing specification of SUP are indicative of the fact that it is essentially the plastic material that is central problem, and not just single-use plastic, which the government is primarily focused upon. So the primary concern with the materials that are categorized as SUP is that they are designed to be disposable products, discarded after one use. Their use and throw characteristics makes them a cause of litter, and they're not usually recycled. Most of them are dumped in landfill, oceans, or are burned. And their excess visibility in public spaces and the growing concerns around single-use plastics breaking down into microplastics have framed them as a major concern. However, the rules do not frame plastic production and the plastic material used for industrial purposes as a problem. It is often assumed that plastic products other than single-use plastics are recyclable and hence environment friendly. Next slide, please. So from here on, I'm going to focus on the varying effects of the single-use plastic ban across waste economies in Delhi. I'm primarily going to focus on my on three sets of respondents. So the first one is Moidul. Moidul, and this he's basically an itinerant buyer and seller, and is part of the informal economy around the Bhalsawa landfill in Delhi, which is again located at the northwest periphery of the city. And Horinder Raj is a scheduled caste scrap dealer. So he's a much more established dealer than Moidul, and basically he's part of the formal economy, but the workers that he's employed are part of the informal economy. And he collects stash and materials from big scrap dealers across the city. And after that, I'm going to focus on recyclers, who are basically the factory dealers and traders in the industrial area of the city, which are Narela and Bhavana, and again located on the northwest periphery of the city. So, Trent, how much time do I have? So Moidul hails from West Bengal in India, and his makeshift house is located right in front of the Bhalsawa landfill in Delhi. He's a small-time scrap dealer who deals in plastic sacks that he often refers to as katta in Hindi, and operates within the realm of informal economy. I discuss Moidul's narrative to understand the journey of a waste picker who ascends to become a scrap dealer, and how this entails multiple mobilities, both upward and downward, contingent upon the demand and supply of discarded materials, market prices and their relationship with recyclers and traders in the business, and finally, unseen catastrophes such as COVID-19. His journey is a classic example of a waste picker becoming a scrap dealer and eventually drowning in losses. So, like many other waste pickers and scrap dealers, Moidul left his house at a very young age and came to Delhi in search of work. Initially, he worked as a waste picker around the landfills, and eventually he started working with his cousin at a glass warehouse. Part of his job was to segregate glass materials based on color, quality, and but however, he was not earning enough money. So his work at different warehouses gave him adequate exposure and confidence to start his own plastic warehouse. Uh, so once he started his own plastic warehouse. Sometimes he bought plastic sacks and sometimes plastic carrier bags collected by waste pickers across the landfill on daily basis. So, and part of it the part of it also included basically drying those sacks under the sun. The drying of these sacks is an important step because wet items fetch less money. Finally, he sold them off to traders across industrial areas, basically Narela and Bhavana in the city. Unlike many other scrap dealers who would often sell off their materials to bigger scrap dealers, Moidul was directly able to sell his stuff to traders in the industrial area. This is, although is not a very common practice among scrap dealers because they are unable to find such big market for themselves. When I initially met Moidul in December 2018, he was satisfied with his work and the price of the materials. He often referred to himself that we are people who earn on daily basis and eat accordingly. His earning at that time was around rupees 35,000 a month. However, when I met him again in August 2019, which is around the time when the plastic ban was imposed, he was extremely dissatisfied with his work. He told me that one bale was priced at rupees 7 and 7.5 rupees INR, and now it is priced at 5 rupees INR. Moreover, now it was difficult for him to sell single-use plastic products such as carrier bags which were below 50 microns, and much of his material constituted of carrier bags which were below 50 microns. So in comparison to previous years, he did not earn enough. But nevertheless, he survived 2019 plastic ban. But it's just that he could not sell his stuff to the bigger traders as he could in 2018 and early 2019. However, he could still survive that time. But what made his condition worse was like his financial losses increased much more during COVID-19 and its effect on the on the large Indian economy. So due to lack of work and joblessness, many migrants had to go back to their home states, and so did Moidul. But somehow he's like staying back at home for a longer period of time. He could save much lot of money for him. However, when he came back to Delhi, as the situation got better in the city, he could not really survive himself in the city. He realized that not only it was difficult to find buyers for his own materials, but he had lost his space from where he used to operate in the around the landfill site. There are like even I mean, he was primarily dealing in plastic materials, but the landfill sites are also complex sites where there were local mafias operating in that area. The economic situation was very bad. So in all of this, he was again reduced to a situation where he was forced to do the work of waste picking, but he refused to do that work. Instead, what he started doing was that he started collecting materials from okay, Trent, I'll just take 2 more minutes and wrap up. So he started collecting materials from different scrap dealers across the landfill area, and then would sell them to industrialists in different parts of the city. So, but his own work as an itinerant buyer and seller had stopped because of the plastic ban and because of the COVID-19 in the country and across the world in general. And similarly, now there are two other narratives of, one is that of Hurinder Raj, who's a scheduled caste trader around the landfill area, and then that of industrialist, uh, basically recyclers in the industrial area of the city. So I don't think I have enough time, so I'll just conclude, and maybe possibly we can talk about the other two narratives in the discussion session. So could we go to the final slide, please? So in this presentation, my aim has been to bring together governance of materials and how it is shaped by market dynamics and optics of recycling, and the relationality between the materials and the politics around them that reinforces each other. Here, the power relations are directed towards different actors positioned in the waste economy, and the attention to these materials, to these power relations, entanglement between plastic materials and their governance, especially with respect to recycling, shows that inequalities are produced and reproduced in the informal and formal waste economies in the name of sustainable recycling and environmentalism. Thank you. And I'm sorry that I could not discuss the narrative of industrialists and scrap dealers in the city.
That's okay. Perhaps we'll get onto that later. But yeah, thanks for the interesting presentation. So interesting to hear how something that sounds so much like a good thing, like a ban on single-use plastics, could have such complex effects on the ground. I should just say before we move on to our next speaker that if at any time you have a question for one of our presenters, please you can just submit it through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of today. So our third speaker is Assa DORON, Professor of Anthropology at the Australian National University. In addition to being a co-author of the book Waste of a Nation, which I mentioned before, Assa has written very extensively on the anthropology of health and environment in India, with a special focus on the city of Varanasi. Today, he'll be talking about some of the impacts of plastics on health from an anthropologist's perspective, with special attention to the issue of microplastics. So over to you, Assa.
How does that look?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, hi, everybody, and it's good to be here. And it's really nice to also have these two distinguished speakers before me that really explained how plastics are everywhere. You know that in Japan, as anywhere else in the world, we can see them, we can feel them, we can hold them. But today I want to talk to you about the more invisible life of plastic, those tiny plastics that Robin Jeffrey spoke about, called microplastics. We eat microplastics, we drink microplastics, we even excrete microplastic and breathe it every day. It's in our clothes, it's in our sewage, it's in our water pipes, and it's even in the dust that we breathe every day. In other words, we are suspended in this kind of invisible web of microplastics. So what are these microplastics? So let's start with a few basic definitions to understand what we're talking about. So these are very tiny particles, and they are usually seen as less than 5 millimeters in size. Now there's smaller ones that are called nanoplastics, which are even tinier. I'm not going to go into it today. But the microplastics that we're going to talk about today are those that have been identified in a range of places in our environment, including water bodies, from rivers to lakes to oceans, other regions like polar region, and I'll talk about it a little bit, tropical regions, and different ecologies of soils, dust in the air, and of course, in human bodies and non-human bodies like other animals. What are the sources of these microplastics? We commonly think that we divide them into two main sources, which are called the primary sources and the secondary source. So the primary source, as you can see, is the plastic debris, the microbeads in clothes, cosmetic materials that we use every day, and of course, the industrial materials. The secondary source are those that are the degraded aspect of plastics, the one that weather, the ones that create, that are come out of these macroplastics, and they weather through, say, wear and tear or UV sunlight and other such processes. And here you can see a washing machine. A lot of the microplastics that we use that are embedded in our clothes, they are excreted through these kind of washing and cleaning processes. Now, we need to think about how they reach us. What are the kind of pathways? So there's the urban runoffs that we know of, whether it's in places where the stormwater systems transport the microplastics into other bodies or mix with other bodies. Wastewater treatment systems. A lot of these wastewater plants don't have the technologies, especially in India and other places in the global south, to filter and they allow these microplastics into rivers and oceans. And it also is deposited in the atmosphere. Microplastic can be transported through the air and settle in different water bodies. So what is the fate of these microplastics and how do they appear? Let's talk about water, for example. So you can see they accumulate in the oceans, in lakes and rivers. They also create the sedimentation, where they settle in the bottom of water bodies. And as such, they are taken up by all sorts of marine organisms. These microplastics, it's not only the turtle that we always see with the kind of plastics or the animals that ingest it, but also these shellfish and other small marine life that ingest it as part of their everyday life. They're also found in human bodies, in our tissues, in our lungs. They were found in breast milk, and of course, intestines. In the global south, often what happens as a result of waste management infrastructure, which lacks or is still incapable to deal with these kind of tiny microplastics. And also microplastic travels. They are like global citizens. They travel with animals, right? They travel with you can see here those seagulls. They found scientific research has shown that seagulls can transport and other animals can transport microplastics across vast areas. And they can cause internal injuries, blockages in the digestive systems of animals. They have their chemical effects as well, can be carried as pollutants, and they accumulate in the food chain that we ingest in other non-human animals. These have ecological consequences, of course. It disrupts marine life or ecosystems, biodiversity, and it can even spread pathogens. These pathogens are known as superbugs, for example. This is the most extreme form of this. And that those superbugs are the bacteria that have developed this resistance to all the antibiotics that we throw at it. Now, this is a very serious concern, and I want to take this as an example to highlight how microplastics are very much part of our everyday life in this kind of invisible web that surrounds us. So how are these microplastics related to, say, the climate change or climate crisis? And how do they transport these pathogens? So there are several interrelated processes that we need to think about. Of course, the climate itself is related to fossil fuels, plastic production and consumption that we heard people speak about, and the warming of the planet. But more specifically, scientists have also found that microplastics are traveling. They serve as an ideal home for these kind of superbugs, these bacteria and pathogens, which are hitchhiking on these microplastics, whether in the atmosphere or in the sea. So scientists are really worried about how these pathogens are carried over long distances and endure for much longer time than initially thought, effectively making them global travelers. So due to the, let's think about it this way. The Earth is warming up. Say we spoke about the polar regions. The Arctic region is witnessing a gradual thawing of its ground. This thawing in the permafrost is a phenomenon that has the risk of releasing not only methane gases, but also these long dormant bacteria, viruses from that permafrost. then they're released into this human activity that warms the planet is on the rise. With that, we also see opening sea routes and increased exploration of these natural resources by different countries, which result in heightened traffic in the region. They carry plastics and other materials. As a consequence, you have new routes where these microplastics can emerge and hitchhike. And this offers an increased chance of encountering these microplastics, which, as we said before, they house these pathogens and then tag along in human bodies and animal bodies. So there are serious consequences which are invisible to the naked eye that these kind of microplastics can pose for humanity and the environment and other ecological aspects. So what are these effects? We know that they contaminate the soil, that they can accumulate in different parts, and they affect the quality and the nutrient cycle of the earth. They impact the plants. They may hinder the growth of nutrient uptake by these plants, and they have potential consequences for various terrestrial and marine organisms and ecosystems, as we already spoke about. In the case of human and animal health implications, we know about ingestions, that they can enter the human body through contaminated food and water. They pose serious health risks, potential long-term effects on human health and animal. These are being studied. We know very little about this, but as I said before, there's increasingly scientific studies that demonstrate the effects of these microplastics. They disrupt our microbiome and the microbial ether around us, and there is a very urgent need to start researching these concerns, and very urgent need for regulation. In India, we know that these microplastics are questions also of scale. So the scale of the issue has already been highlighted by the previous speakers, but then we need more studies about the extent of microplastic pollutions in India. There's only very few studies that review this, and we need also education and figures about what this contamination is and how it figures in Indian water bodies and wider ecosystems. We need to emphasize the need to effectively implement effective measures and policies to curb the spread of these microplastics. We already heard about some government actions, and on microplastics, the Indian government, where I work in, has already discussed the plastic waste management rules, which have been addressed before, and the ban on plastic and microbeads in cosmetics is something that's come into effect in 2020. However, the implementation is rather patchy, and they continue to import, of course, and sell all these cosmetics containing microplastics. What might be the mitigations? And I'm coming to this concluding a slide where I want to maybe remind us of what ways we might be able to mitigate and prevent the spread of these microplastics, which are, again, originate from plastics. So they improve the waste management, reducing plastic waste and promoting recycling and reducing, ban on these microbeads, phasing them out, and phasing it out in personal care products. And very importantly, of course, not only the visible plastics, but also public awareness and education about the serious implications of these microplastics, which saturate our lives in both our ecologies and non-human lives. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Assa, for that fascinating and slightly disturbing presentation. Okay, so we'll now move on to, we're going to now screen a recorded presentation by Anish MALPANI. And Assa, if I could just ask you to stop sharing screen.
Yep.
So Anish MALPANI was originally hoping to join us on the panel today, but unfortunately had another commitment. So Anish's work with the social enterprise Ashaya is a very interesting case study. So it's taking on an aspect of plastics recycling that's technologically very challenging and trying to do so in a way that's both socially responsible and economically viable. So let's listen to Anish.
Hi, my name is Anish MALPANI. and I'm the founder of Ashaya. And without, we make the world's first recycled sunglasses from impossible to recycle packets of chips. I'm sorry I can't be there with you guys today. I'm in the air. I'm literally midair right now. But I thought I'd quickly do a video to kind of give you an overview of what we do here and how we recycle this sort of plastic. So the first question I get is why packets of chips, right? Turns out that when I was researching the waste space in India, I found out that 60% of plastic in India is recycled. We're one of the highest recycling rates in the world. But the 40% that's not recycled mainly comprises flexible packaging, especially the notorious metallized multi-layer plastic packaging, or MLP, or think packets of chips, chocolate wrappers, Tetra Pak. This is considered impossible to recycle because it contains 3 to 5 different types of materials fused together, such as PP, PE, PET, aluminium, and paper. It's high volume, it's inconsistent. Like a chocolate wrapper is different from a chips packet, is different from a Tetra Pak. So it's a recycler's nightmare. And this is the reason why less than 1% of this plastic is recycled worldwide. And 80% of all ocean leakage is not straws, it's flexible packaging. It's honestly the worst kind of plastic waste and the least recycled. So what do we do? In our patent pending process, we chemomechanically extract building blocks from the MLP, and then we convert them into high quality recycled materials, which we then convert into final products that we sell through our brand Without. And what's really unique about our work is that 50 to 75% of it can be run by waste pickers. So the USP for recycling process is very interesting. So there are some other solutions that exist for the little MLP that is recycled. You might be familiar with them. They're waste to energy, where you burn it for electricity. It's waste to fuel, which is called pyrolysis. It's also mixed with concrete and cement to make bricks and roads and panels. While these solutions are not bad, they're mainly end-of-life solutions and have poor economics and limited applicability. Our process, because we chemomechanically extract building blocks because we extract materials from the MLP, the new materials we get are more recyclable, higher quality, toxin-free, and have higher consistency. We're also working on repolymerizing PET, which is still a work in progress. So this is what the MLP looks like when we get it. It's normally dirtier than this. This is what it looks like after it's shredded. Then the separation starts, right? So we demetallize the MLP through our patent pending process and simultaneously depolymerize the PET and separate that out. So you start getting a separation. Polyolefins are essentially polypropylene plus polyethylene. And we get the monomer of PET. Then we compound these into new materials. We get, enhanced polyolefins and get repolymerized PET. And we convert the polyolefins right now into sunglasses and coasters. So yeah, these are the first ever sunglasses that we created. The frame is made from this impossible to recycle plastic waste, and it's a true 90% recycled. There's also a QR code on the side, and if you scan the QR code, you get to see where the waste came from, which waste pickers worked on it, how it was recycled. And also we have, it's functional. They're UV polarized lenses, they're durable, they're bendy. We drove a car over them and nothing happened. Also, 10% of our sales go towards scholarships for children of waste pickers, ensuring that they stay in school. We give end-of-life recycling. We neutralize our carbon footprint. So yeah, the idea is to make the most sustainable product out there. But we're not just making sunglasses, right? Sunglasses are not going to solve the MLP problem. They're not going to solve the waste problem or the waste picker. This sunglasses is just a proof of concept that, hey, you can take this material that's impossible to recycle and have high-end applications for it. The business model we're building is a fully integrated recycling center that processes not just MLP, but all plastic waste for starters, converts them into high-quality products and materials, and empowers waste pickers along the way, right? We can sell products B2C with some B2B corporate gifting opportunities. But in the long run, it has to be material sales because you want to be able to move large amounts of materials, right? Or licensing our technology to governments and foundations. And the kicker is that we're not doing this to make money. We're truly an impact-first startup. We've even amended our memorandums of association to legally bind us to our impact. But we still believe in creating economically viable solutions. But profit generation is not the same as profit maximization. In fact, we believe that we want to generate profit to maximize our impact, which is empowering waste pickers, recycling impossible to recycle plastic waste, and diverting it away from landfills, right? And just because we're impact first doesn't mean we can't be cutting edge when it comes to the technology that we develop. In fact, we have to be cutting edge to be in our technology to solve the complex problem that is waste in India, right? Like plastic is only 10% of all waste. 50% of the waste in India is organic or wet, and only 5 to 6% this is composite. And organic waste is also a really big problem because it releases methane, which is a greenhouse gas that's 80 times worse than carbon dioxide. 7% recyclables like paper and glass, 3% is e-waste, and 30% is inert. And what is inert? Inert is sand, cells, stones, bones. It's also stuff that doesn't degrade. And we don't talk about this enough and talk about solutions for this enough, right? But the elephant in the room is that there are 1.5 to 4 million waste pickers in India who live multidimensionally poor lives. And this is not just low income, but it's these are low caste migrant workers. It's low dignity work. It's dangerous work. 30% of waste pickers in Pune, the city I'm in, have been bitten by dogs. And what's really ironic is that, remember early on, I said 60% of plastic in India is recycled. That's because of these waste pickers. These waste pickers make a living by recycling, by collecting and separating waste. 50% of the income of a waste picker is through plastic. So you can't just think about, so in India, when you think of banning plastic, you also have to think of livelihoods of the informal economy of the waste picker. So it's a lot more complex. And a waste problem doesn't stop there. There's, there's a big environmental issue, obviously. There's a big social issue. It's also an economic issue. 80% is untreated. So much value is lost. There's the government involved. People are greenwashing. There's bioplastics, It's a very complex, interconnected problem that I'm sure you'll get a better understanding of today after you speak to everybody. So our long-term goal is to build decentralized, small to medium-sized recycling centers in every sub-district in India that process not only plastic, but all types of solid waste. Remember, waste is a local problem, and currently we have centralized solutions. We really want to build decentralized solutions where waste is treated as close to the source as possible. We also want to formalize and empower the informal sector, and also create financially sustainable solutions. Right? These decentralized material cradles will be supported by centralized R&D labs that constantly innovate and increase the value of the material. We're building our first R&D lab here in Pune, so if you're ever in India, please come visit if you have the time. And we can't do this alone, right? Collaboration is key. So it started off with just the two of us. Dr. Jitendra is a research scientist on the team with us, but we're now a whole bunch of former waste pickers, operators, engineers, scientists working together, trying to make this happen. We formally, employ waste pickers into our supply chain. We also pay waste pickers. We buy our waste directly from a waste picker collective that's in this city called Swachh Cooperative, giving them additional income because this is waste that nobody else buys, right? And we pay a premium for it. And then also, as I said earlier, 10% of our sales goes towards keeping children of waste pickers in school, because the idea is to break the chain, right? Is to make sure that children of waste pickers don't end up as waste pickers. So I mean, look, this is just the start. We have a long way to go. But yeah, hopefully that was a little insightful. Again, I'm sorry I couldn't be there. Have a great day.
Okay, wonderful. Great to look at some of the potential solutions to the issues that we've been talking about. Our final speaker today is Professor Jun Nakatani from the Department of Urban Engineering at the University of Tokyo. Nakatani Sensei specializes in the life cycle assessment of plastics, and today will be giving us an overview of how plastics are managed in Japan, including the thorny issue of whether incineration represents a meaningful solution to the plastics crisis. So Nakatani Sensei, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So let me share my slide. Okay, so thank you, Chair. So I'd like to start my talk. Sorry, wait. Okay, today I'd like to talk to you about the life cycle assessment of plastic resource circulation. And I mainly talk about the lessons learned from the Japanese experience. So let me start with a very brief self-introduction. So I'm the associate professor at the Department of Urban Engineering, and my major one is the life cycle assessment of material for analysis. And I have applied this kind of analytical tools to mainly to the plastic recycling issue. Okay, so this is the very brief overview of the political aspect of the plastics. In 2015, the Circular Economy Policy Action Plan was published, and one of the 5 priority areas of this Circular Economy Action Plan, the plastics was included is one of the 5 priority areas. At the same time, in 2018, in the G7 summit, the Ocean Plastics Charter was signed by 5 of the G7 nations, excluding the US and Japan. What I'd like to emphasize here is that this Ocean Plastics Charter mainly aims at preventing waste and litter from being released into the environment, but this Ocean Plastics Charter also aims at increasing the efficient use of resources and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the key messages of today of my talk is that there are a lot of aspects in plastic issues, and there are a lot of solutions are proposed for tackling with those plastic issues. But we need to we need to understand the relationship between those plastic issues and solutions. For example, today's main topic, plastic recycling. Plastic recycling is mainly contributes to the alleviation of the climate change impacts or the reduction in the fossil resource consumption. Bio-based plastics also contribute to the reduction in the fossil resource consumption and the climate change impacts. What about the marine plastic pollution issue? I think these marine plastic pollution issues are the problem of how to properly collect and treat the waste plastics. It is not necessarily directly linked to the recycling issue. But this proper waste collection and treatment is also very, very important for enhancing the plastic recycling. So many solutions and many plastic issues are linked each other. I think the reduction in the plastic use is a kind of almighty solutions, but it is sometimes very difficult to reduce the plastic usage. So today, I would like to mainly talk about the relationship between the plastic recycling and reduction in the climate change impacts. Okay, so let me start with the circular economy policy in Europe. In 2018, the European strategy for plastics was published. And in this, the circular economy vision, there are a lot of important keywords included. For example, they emphasize the importance of the separate collections or how to make the variable feedstock from plastics. In addition to that, they also emphasize the importance of the economic aspects. So that one of the targets of the circular economy policy, the European strategy policy, European strategy for plastics, one of the targets is how to create the new jobs by recycling of plastics. They also emphasize the importance of the chemical industry. They asked the chemical industry to be involved in the plastic recycling. So this figure is a very important conceptual figure of the circular economy of plastics. There are a lot of options for recycling, not only the mechanical recycling, But for example, the chemical recycling, there are a lot of options for recycling. The mechanical recycling is regarded as inner loop recycling because plastics are recycled into plastics. On the other hand, chemical recycling or feedstock recycling is regarded as outer loop recycling because in those chemical recycling, plastics are recycled back into the feedstock of the chemical products. The circular economy policy regarded as the mechanical recycling, it should be prioritized over the chemical recycling because they are the inner loop. But I'd like to investigate or I'd like to verify this concept, whether it is correct or not, based on the Japanese experience. This is a conceptual figure published by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. This concept is totally in line with the basic concept of circular economy policy. They are aiming at maximize this kind of recycling loops and how to reduce this kind of linear economies. But I think that a kind of chemical or feedstock recycling, the plastics are used as a feedstock in other industries, such a recycling is outside the scope of their vision. So I'd like to focus on this kind of utilization of plastic resources as a feedstock in other industries. So from now on, I'd like to talk about the current situation in the plastic recycling in Japan. Last year, the Japanese government published a new recycling policy of plastics. In this new plastic recycling law, they are aiming at reducing plastic marine debris, marine plastic pollutions, and also they are aiming at shifting towards the circular economy. And they are also thinking about how to contribute to the carbon neutral society. This flow chart shows the current situation of the recycling material flows of plastics in Japan. Around 10 million tons of plastics are consumed domestically in Japan, and around 8 to 9 million tons of plastic waste are generated every year. Among these 8 to 9 million tons, the 85% are considered to be effectively utilized. But among this 85%, only 22% are mechanically or materially recycled. That means only 22% are recycled back into plastics. In addition, half of the recycling depends on the demand from the overseas. So the plastics recycled in Japan, inside and utilized in Japan, that is very, very limited. So the Japanese recycling system, Japanese plastic system is totally depends on largely depends on the energy recovery or chemical recycling, mainly the energy recovery. So in the Japanese plastic recycling law, the plastics or domestic plastic waste are categorized into 3 categories. The first one is PET bottles, beverage PET bottles, and the other one is that plastic packaging other than PET bottles. And in addition to that, non-packaging plastic products became at the target of the recycling in the new plastic recycling law last year. But this recycling of plastic products have a very short history. So I'd like to talk about the PET bottle recycling and plastic packaging recycling. Very roughly speaking, the PET bottle recycling in Japan is very going well. And because they have several properties that is suitable for recycling. As a result, the Japanese plastic PET bottles are utilized as the raw material for various kinds of plastic products, like sheets or molded products, fiber products, and recently, many beverage makers are very active to utilize the recycled PET as a raw material for their PET bottles again. So this kind of closed loop recycling are already introduced in Japan. When we look at this PET bottle recycling from the life cycle assessment viewpoints, so this recycling of PET bottles are also justified by the environmental impacts evaluated by LCA. This is a result of the greenhouse gas emissions for various types of recycling and the incineration of PET bottles. In this figure, the positive side, upper side of this bar graph indicates how much environmental impacts are generated from the recycling process. And the negative side of this bar graph indicates how much environmental impacts are avoided by recycling. Avoided means the usage of the primary production from the fossil fuels could be reduced through recycling. So when we consider both aspects, the positive emissions and the negative emissions, avoided emissions, this plot indicates the net environmental impacts of recycling. So in this blue bar indicates the material recycling of PET bottles. When we compare this incineration option, that you can see that the PET bottle recycling contributes to the reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions. And in addition to that, the chemical recycling, the outer loop recycling, has the much environmental impact compared to the material recycling. So in the case of PET bottle recycling, the basic concept principles proposed by the Circular Economy Action Plan is valid. It is true for this PET bottle recycling. But one of the key of this kind of good quality recycling is the design for recycling of PET bottles in Japan. All the PET bottles in Japan are designed for recycling. For example, only the polyethylene or polypropylene specific type of plastics are used as the caps, and not colored bottles. All the PET bottles in the market of Japan is transparent, and labels can be easily removed from the PET bottles. Such a recycling design contributes to the very good quality recycling of PET bottles. I'm sorry, I'd like to talk in another 1 minute. But on the other hand, the recycling of plastic packaging other than PET bottles, there are many constraints. And one of the main reasons of this difficulties in recycling of plastic packaging other than PET bottles is that the plastic packaging is composed of various kinds of plastics, many resin types, and many forms of plastics. This kind of mixed plastics are sometimes very difficult to recycle. So as a result, this is a result of the life cycle assessment of the recycling of plastic packaging. In this result, incineration is the worst option, but when we compare with the material recycling and chemical recycling or high efficient energy recovery, the material recycling was not the best option. The best option was the feedstock recycling or energy recovery. Through the comparison of the LCA studies of PET bottles and plastic packaging, we can understand that this material recycling is not necessarily the best option for all types of plastics. For the single type of plastics, like PET bottles, the material recycling is a very good option. But on the other hand, for this kind of mixed plastics, the other options like feedstock recycling or energy recovery could contribute to much better than the material recycling. So we need to design the plastic recycling system considering the quality of the waste plastics and the technology aspects. So thank you for your listening.
Hey, thank you, Nakatani Sensei. So that brings us to the end of our presentations. We'll now move on to an open discussion. As I said before, if you have any questions for any of our speakers today, you can submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But I thought before we go to questions from the audience, I might take advantage of my privilege as chair and ask a few questions myself. So I thought I might pose a question to all of the panelists and ask, since the focus of World Environment Day today is solutions to the plastics crisis, I was wondering if any of you had, perhaps if you could identify perhaps one area where you see really promising developments, what gives you room for hope regarding plastics? Robin, did you want to start? You seem to have.
No, I'm thinking of what a very curly question that is. I think I come back to some of the things that Professor Nakatani was saying, and also that Anish MALPANI was talking about in his video, the notion of decentralizing, of keeping plastic materials as contained as possible within relatively narrow geographical areas and being able to extract value from them in that way, so that we don't end up with having to have great decentralized plants. And also it perhaps in social terms, it gives the creators of plastic a rather closer involvement with the toxic material that they're using. That is, that when they see what is going on in the collection, the elaborate processes that need to be carried on, it may give people a little greater investment, particularly at the level of household waste and local people. One of the most interesting possibilities I saw was in Tiruvananthapuram, where they were trying to work zonal centers where people brought their waste, but they were creating the zonal center as a kind of coffee shop, meeting place. You brought your plastic bottles, you dropped them there, but you had a cup of coffee and met friends. There was a chessboard for old people like me to play chess with their friends. That kind of community involvement, I think, is one of the things, of course, that's essential in any kind of waste management, but particularly plastic.
Yeah, sounds like a very innovative approach. Do any of our other speakers have thoughts on, where do you see the most space for hope regarding plastics?
I very much agree with all the others that have spoken. For me, it's not about the individual. So telling us to recycle and telling us to reduce our footprint and reduce our consumption is part of that kind of green economy that many economists have liked to flag as the important part of reducing our footprint. I think that there is no evidence that any of this green economy has been successful since it was devised in the 1990s. And I think the change needs to come from governments, from producers, with serious and severe laws, alongside what has already been spoken about here, especially Professor Nakatani has spoken about, ensuring that the design process itself, there is a built-in component that enables a better recycling process.
Okay. Nakatani Sensei, did you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I agree with the opinions from the both professors, and regional circulation is also important, and the recycling design is also very, very important. So my idea is that how to mix the various options. The material recycling is a very good recycling option, but it is, as I told you before, it is not easy. It is difficult to apply to the mixed type of plastics. So recycling design is very important, or waste collection is very important, or sorting technology is also very important. So how to mix, how to combine the various technologies or consumers' behavior. Such a mix, such a very good relationship or linkage is the key to improve the at least the recycling system of plastics.
Factoring recycling in at every sort of level of the chain.
Yeah.
Aparna, did you have any thoughts? Is there anything that gives you hope for?
Yes.
I think for me, my understanding is that, like, I agree with Professor DORON when he says that it's not individual. And so I think like it is at the very basic and the most lower level that I see hope, where informal waste pickers are heavily invested in collecting waste materials. But also when we look at the whole process of recycling, and especially in countries like India, especially Delhi, when you go to these factory units where recycling is actually happening, they are extremely toxic in nature, because it happens at a very informal level. The melting of the plastic and also the washing of the plastic, there is a lot of dust, and there are lots of toxic fumes in the process. So my understanding is that even if we are looking for better plastic recycling solutions, we also have to also look at the processes of recycling, which do not at present seem very environment friendly. And also on the community solutions, for example, I think few years back in Mumbai, there were these solutions where you put back your PET bottles in these garbage cans, and then you would get 1 rupee, which is INR back. So most of the scholars who were working on it, they said that it is a process of greenwashing, because again, it is helping the producers to produce more virgin plastic and more plastic. So the production goes on while we are looking at a certain form of recycling. So I think personally for me, there is this conundrum, and I don't know how, if we are actually moving towards resolving it. Yeah.
So some cautionary notes on some of the possible solutions there. I guess that's some of the issues that you've raised relate to another question which I had, which was, what do you see as being the appropriate scale for action regarding the plastics challenge? I mean, it seems like on the one hand, you could say that a lot of the solutions are at the municipal level where waste gets managed, or is there room for improvement or in progress through national and international agreements? Robin sort of touched on some of these in his presentation, but a sort of related point, I was wondering if any of you had been following the recent deliberations at the United Nations to develop some binding international instruments for regulating plastic waste. And do you have any thoughts on how effective it's been and what the prospects are?
I'm not sure, have others followed last week's discussions in Paris? I gather they ended yesterday without really a very satisfactory outcome. The outcome, and it hasn't been well reported certainly in the media that I see, both online or here. The one story I've seen on yesterday's activity was in a Manila newspaper, drawing on a correspondent who was in Paris. But the outcome seemed to be that the 55 countries who were in the coalition to have a binding treaty, their efforts were not successful. And the big petroleum producers, led by Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, the United States, they blocked this. And the outcome seems to have been, well, what we've got to do is we meet again in a year, and by that stage, we must have talked enough to have a treaty ready to put forward to that meeting when it happens. But that's, as I understand it, and it's a very imperfect understanding of what finally happened yesterday. I gather the Australian Environment Minister is back in the country already, because I heard her interviewed this morning, I think from Canberra or Sydney, but she had attended throughout the week in Paris.
I think, and I have a question to Professor Nakatani in this regard, because I remember reading several times that these treaties are very difficult to implement because a lot of plastic depends on the fossil fuel industry and on the price of oil. Now, when the price of oil fluctuates, the nature of plastic itself changes. So you have instances, for example, in the economic crisis of 2008, where the price of oil shot up. So in the United States, they changed the plastic packaging to make it lighter so that you can ferry the plastic across the thousands of kilometers. Now that's all well and fine, but then the plastic recycling facilities were not calibrated to recycle the new type of light plastic. So I wonder if this kind of issues are also present in Japan. Are you dependent on the kind of fossil fuel industry that is the engine of the world?
Professor Nakatani, did you want to respond?
Okay, so the similar situation happened in Japan. Mainly, the demand for the recycled plastics are strongly affected by the oil price. So when the oil price is higher, in such cases, in such a situation, the recycled plastics, there are much demand for the plastic recycling. But on the other hand, when the oil price going down, in that case, the recyclers have no, yes, so the recycling become the very serious economic situation. So, but this is just one example, but the recycling of plastics are strongly affected by oil price. That is true, I think.
Aparna, any thoughts on these questions of scale and I'm not sure whether you followed the United Nations deliberations the last week.
Mm.
Okay, you're muted.
Sorry, so no, I have not yet followed the deliberations. So yeah, I don't think I have anything substantial to say on that.
Okay. All right. So we might go to a question from the audience. We haven't had many come in, so if you do have any questions, please feel free to submit them. So Billy Joel Pedroso has asked, when it comes to informing the people of the urgent need to mitigate the use of plastic or reduce its negative effects on our health and on the environment, how have we used personal tech gadgets like smartphones to achieve this goal quickly? I feel like this may be an interesting synergy for Professors Jeffrey and Doron of your two bodies of work on mobile phones and on garbage.
We came to garbage through mobile phones. Assa will tell you.
Well, I do know that in Australia, there was the War on Waste, which was a very, quite an important show on the ABC. And at the time, what they did in order to show that Australia is actually not recycling its plastic is they plotted very small digital devices into plastic materials and tried to trace the plastic trajectory. and see whether it leaves the country, whether it's actually being recycled or just stashed somewhere for the long term. And unfortunately, what they discovered with these digital, new digital technology is that much of the especially soft recycling plastic ends nowhere and is just stashed because of the various laws now implemented across the world, that it's very difficult to outsource your plastic unless you smuggle it across the seas. But maybe it's a good advice for a startup.
Interesting idea.
Well, at one stage, that was one of the examples that was given to me for the benefits of 5G technology, that 5G would be so powerful and have so much frequency to use, you could actually chip every piece of plastic packaging with a chip that would tell you where it was. And so you would get these aggregations of plastics of particular kinds that could then be collected in a systematic kind of way. It sounded a little bit fanciful, but for somebody trying to sell 5G, it was one way of bringing the mobile phone into the picture as a contributor to waste mitigation.
See, any signs that that's been followed up on?
I think, not that I'm aware of, but
I do think that what MALPANI was talking about in his presentation is something that does touch on the digital technology, right? So that you can, by scanning a barcode on those fantastic glasses, you can actually trace the origin of the plastics from different places, and also the people who collected that plastic. And that allows you to be in some way more conscious of the kind of trajectories that plastic takes in our daily lives.
Very cool aspect of what Ashaya is doing there. Aparna, did you have thoughts on this?
I mean, in my research, I have not particularly looked at it, so I don't know much about it, but
Okay.
at
Do
a very
waste workers themselves sort of working on the ground, does digital technology come into their work in any way?
in no possible way, because it's at a very basic and at a very local level. So I mean, some of them, they do not even have smartphones to even to have access to such apps or technology that they can map the routes of where the plastic is going. But I think there is some bit of awareness through apps and through small startups, like of course, like with the waste Swachh Bharat Abhiyan in India, the waste management program that is going on. So they have their own app, and then they generate awareness through that. But I am not aware of practices where they're talking about how technology is used to map the routes.
I see. Professor Nakatani, did you have any thoughts on use of digital technology? Professor.
Yeah. So, yeah. Honestly speaking, I have no good idea about it, but the matching between the demand and the supply of the recycled material is also important, and it can be partly solved by such a technology. So where is the the recycled material supply, and where is the recycled material demand? Such a matching is also solved by such a digital technology.
I see. Okay, we might ask a final question now. So, from Makisato, it says, in terms of plastic recycling, it seems there is a different layers of optimality, that there's no single solution for all. At this moment, it seems that the optimality itself varies in countries and in regions. I would like to ask Professor Nakatani, has he thought about the way about any tool to investigate to find the optimal way, the optimal form of recycling, and at which level of incineration? I'm not sure if I've understood the question, but okay, perhaps you can comment on this.
Okay, so thank you very much. Very good question. So I think as Sato-san told, the optimal situation may be different. It should be different according to the regions or countries or the situations. So to find out the optimal solutions, we need to firstly, we need to know the material flows of plastics, and in addition to that, the environmental impacts of the plastic solutions, the recycling solutions, or how much environmental impacts are generated from the production of plastics, including fossil-based plastics or bio-based plastics. So finally, we need to how do you say? We need to design the whole circulation of plastics, not only the material recycling or not only the reduction in the plastics, but how much plastic demand can be satisfied by the recycled products, or how much plastic demand can be satisfied by the bio-based plastics. How do you say? It's difficult, but how to design the plastic recycling or plastic circulation system from such a viewpoint is very important. I'm not sure whether this is the good answer to our questions or not, but anyway, the material flow analysis and life cycle assessment is a basic tools to think about this kind of optimal solutions for plastics, I believe.
Right. Well, I guess it sort of relates to another question that I've had in the back of my mind throughout this discussion, which is that we're talking a lot about the recycling end of plastics and where plastics end up. Nakatani Sensei, in your presentation, you did mention that the overuse of plastics is really the burning issue, but that it's very difficult. What progress have we made in terms of reducing the use of plastics and perhaps finding alternative materials? I suppose that's a question to any of our speakers, but Nakatani Sensei in particular.
It also comes up in connection with one of the questions that's just come in on the screen, Trent, about the possibilities of bioplastics made of starch.
Right.
These degradable ones. I'm sure Professor Nakatani will have some views on that, or on how widespread that kind of technology can become.
Nakatani Sensei.
So can I share another slide?
Sure.
Yes.
So yes, one of the alternatives for the fossil-based plastics is bioplastics, including bio-based plastics or bio-based plastics. So sorry. This is the projection of the future production of the bio-based bioplastics. This is the predicted by European bioplastics. In the near future, the amount of bio-based plastics became 3 times larger than the current situation, but it only 7 million tons. 7 million tons nearly equal to the plastic waste amount in Japan, plastic demand in Japan. The total production capacity in the world is only maybe 1%, several percent, less than 10% of the total demand for the plastics. So unfortunately, bioplastics is not the perfect solutions for the alternatives for plastics. So I think the combination of the recycled plastics, bioplastics, and other alternatives, and in addition to that, the reduction in the plastic demand, we need to combine all the possible options to satisfy the plastic demand by non-fossil based plastics.
Okay, now, sorry, before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask, do any of our panelists have questions for each other?
I would like to ask Professor Nakatani, just how much high combustion incineration is there in Japan? How much of Japanese waste goes to the high temperatures incinerators? Is it a very large percentage?
Okay, so in average, the municipal incinerator that has in average 10 to 15% of the power generation efficiency. The 10 to 15%, sorry, 10 to 15%. That is not so high, but a part of them have the 20% or 25%, but in average only 10%. So that is not necessarily the high efficiency, I think.
Had a question as well?
Yeah, I have a question to Professor Nakatani. I mean, I'm still trying to understand that do we have enough proof yet that non-fossil based plastics, what's going to be the impact of these non-fossil based plastics? Because it is like in last 20 years that we could arrive at an understanding what plastic waste means for us. But as of now, do we have any understanding of what non-fossil based plastic would mean in terms of pollution and its impact?
Okay, so let me share again the previous slides. I think one of the big problem about the non-fossil based plastics and the plastic pollution issue is that the bioplastics, that is sometimes confusingly understood, but it is the combined concept of the bio-based plastics and the biodegradable plastics. A part of the biodegradable plastics could contribute to the solution of the plastic pollution issue, but bio-based plastics, this kind of plastics has the same properties as the conventional fossil-based plastics. The difference is that only the raw material feedstock for those plastics are biomass, not the fossil fuel, but the properties of those plastics are just the same as the fossil-based plastics. So this kind of bio-based plastics could contribute to the alleviation of the climate change issue, but it cannot contribute to the plastic pollution issue. So unfortunately, at least in Japan, still many people cannot understand the difference between bio-based and biodegradable plastics. So we need to, firstly, we need to understand the relationship between those solutions, alternatives of fossil-based plastics, and what kind of environmental issue, plastic issue, those alternatives could contribute.
Okay, and,
Yeah.
yes, go ahead, Assa.
I'd like to ask Dr. Agarwal about what happened during COVID and whether you saw an influx in plastic materials in India and why.
So yes, at some level, there was an increase in plastic materials during the pandemic because people were significantly relying on, like in terms of food industry, they were significantly relying on takeaways and deliveries. So of course, there was that increase, but that does not necessarily mean that it led to profits in waste economies, because at least till the first and the second wave in the country, most of the recycling units were closed. So at least, I mean, the factories were processing lot waste which they already had, because again they had the privilege to do that. But at the lower level of the economy, say scrap dealers and waste pickers, they did not have that that infrastructure and the privilege to buy and sell at that level. So and the rates were actually low. It is only towards the end of the second wave that the rates of plastic materials, they started increasing around that time. But before that, they were going in extreme losses. But yes, there was an increase in that sense, but more on consumer oriented plastics, and of course the waste that was being generated in around hospitals. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for that fascinating discussion. I'm afraid that we are going to have to wrap it up, but yeah, I'd like to thank all of the speakers for joining us today, and hope to see you next time at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Trent.
you.
Great pleasure to meet you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Elder.
Bye.